This podcast is brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hello and welcome to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. I'm your host, Molly Troupe, and today with me is David Fisher from Archie Distillery in Australia. Today we're going to be talking about whiskey blending, which we have been doing a lot of lately, but it is such a large and looming topic for spirits production that we can literally talk about this forever. Before we get too involved in the conversation, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering your team needs at no cost to you. Jim Cure, VP of Manufacturing at Red Boot Beverages, says, G&D has been with us since the early days. Their knowledgeable engineers and service techs are there when we need them. We're in the midst of a large expansion, and they have been right there with us to select chiller solutions for today and the future. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. Without further ado, here's David. David, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I really just wanted to get started with how you got involved in the spirits industry.
Yeah, that's an interesting and quite a long answer to that one. So I'll try and shortcut it a little bit. Like a lot of people, I come out of university here or college for the American listeners in Australia, and I was a bartender at that time, making ends meet, and I absolutely loved it. I didn't take it that seriously, and I moved over to the UK, and I got a job at Milk and Honey over in London, which at that time, that was in the early 2000s, was, one of the best bars in the world, and all of a sudden I had to start taking things a little bit more seriously, and I started to dig into spirits and, try to learn a little bit more about them and the base of all these classic cocktails that we're focusing on. And that was like the starting of, I guess, like a long love affair with spirits. Since then, we'll fast forward a little bit, I went and went back to uni, did engineering at uni, was an engineer with a global consulting firm for a little while. And then a friend of mine lured me back into the world of hospitality and spirits with the ultimate lure of opening a bar and a restaurant over in New York City. And as an Australian who grew up on a sheep farm, moving to New York City is a pretty big deal, a pretty big lure. So that got me back into the world of hospo and spirits. And that would have been, I'm just trying to think of the time frame, that would have been 2016 when we were hatching that plan. And then obviously we all kind of know the whole COVID situation happened. So we were over in New York City, which, as everybody in the world knows, was one of the kind of epicenters for the COVID shutdowns and all that kind of stuff. So that heavily derailed our bar and restaurant, which had very little frontage. Anyone who's, I guess, au fait with the kind of the New York situation there, if you had a bit of frontage to the street, they allowed, after the first kind of period of lockdowns, they allowed you to put tables and chairs outside, and people kind of created restaurants outside their restaurants, which allowed people to start back up. We had essentially no frontage that we could utilize, so we couldn't open. So we were shut down for a year, and eventually we kind of pulled the pin. We gave everything up, and I was working for a friend of mine who also had a group of venues in New York, and they were lucky enough to be able to open back up. So I was working for them. And my wife and I decided we wanted to move back home to Oz. And serendipitously, one of my ex-partners from the business venture was back here in Australia, and he was working for Archie, who I'm now working for. And they were about to open up the new distillery, which I'm now working at. And it was quite a large shift in scale. So they were going from a very small craft scale to quite a large kind of, I don't know if you call it not craft or what you call it, but slightly more in the kind of industrial scale, I guess. And that required a whole heap more infrastructure in terms of both labor and, just system structures and stuff like that. And so they were looking to hire back then it was just a sensory analyst, but with a view to growing the kind of blending team to be able to service the new distillery. And I did all of my interviews like this over the internet with the master distiller. We did tastings over the internet, which is quite an interesting situation. I went and bought products. I was then in the States. I went and bought products down the road at the local bottle shop, and he bought the same products back here in Sydney, and we kind of did a tasting over the phone, I guess, just to have a chat, so we could do some sort of kind of sensory kind of discussion, and he could get a bit of an understanding of where I was at on the kind of in the sensory world. And yeah, that's the start of it. So, like I said, a bit of a long story, but it frames out a lot of my thinking, both in blending and just in general in the spirits world, which is, I think, pretty important. I think it's pretty normal for most blenders as well. There's not really, except for in Scotland and maybe, I don't know, to a degree, I guess in Kentucky, there's probably a little bit more of a path to getting into the blending world, but kind of anywhere else in the world, you fall into it some way or another. You're either, in a lab somewhere and someone decides that you've got a good nose and they kind of start pushing you in a certain direction, or, you're a bartender or you're whatever, you're working on the bottling line, or, and somehow you just kind of slowly find your way into the world of blending. And, it's an amazing job. Like I love the job. It's an enviable job, I guess. And so once you get in, it's pretty hard to get out.
Right. It's a hard job, of course, but someone has to do it.
Exactly.
When was the moment when you discovered that you had a good nose? Was it something that it was a self-discovery, or is it something that someone told you?
That's a really interesting question. I think, probably like everyone, you've always got a bit of imposter syndrome, right? And so I would probably say that it'd be someone telling me, not someone, but just generally, right? You kind of, there's never really a moment where someone, knights you as someone with a good nose. It's just, I don't know, you're tasting with people, or, you're the person at the venue who, when a new product comes in, everyone's like, oh, what do you think about that? And, what are you tasting and what are you doing with that? How are you using that in drinks, or what do you think that'd be good for? Or, I don't know, I've always worked in very collaborative teams, so it's always been like, I guess, open discussions in that sense. And I think I also have probably, I wouldn't say an overabundance of confidence, but I have a certain disregard for what other people think of me, I guess. And so I've never really been too afraid of just saying what I think. And I think in sensory, that's really important and a huge barrier to entry. If you're not in an environment where you feel like you can kind of trust the people around you and be a bit vulnerable in what you're saying, then you're not really going to go very far. So I've been very lucky in that sense that, I've always had that kind of ability to kind of chat about what we're seeing in the glass and stuff like that. So I guess it's probably been, more of other people kind of saying it, and then you kind of realize, where your strengths are and stuff like that. And like anyone, I've got strengths and weaknesses. There are definitely some things that I lean on my team more. They have a better kind of acuity on certain things, and I definitely lean on my team in those areas. But then there's other areas where I, will comfortably overrule people because I feel like quite confident in those areas.
Right. And I mean, it's very normal that something, everyone has something that they're a bit nose blind to. Have you found anything specifically that like you really know that you can't pick out in a lineup, or is it just kind of more of a collaborative all around? Because we're all more perceptible in some things at lower ppm than others. I think that's lower thresholds, but there is some some things we know, like, geosmin is one where you can be absolutely either nose blind to it or think it's a positive attribute. And some people really just like, oh yeah, it has this really great note, and it's actually not a great note. And then there's some people who just hate it, and they can pick it out at like way lower thresholds than maybe even are needed.
Yeah, I have probably a terrible combination of some of those things. I love weird things. I love really challenging flavors, like baijiu and stuff like that. Like really, really challenging stuff.
Those are challenging.
Yeah, they're really challenging. I have like a kind of a sick affiliation with those kind of weird flavors. I don't know what it is. But I'm very aware of that. So, I'm very careful for me when I'm tasting something for myself. I really enjoy it, but I also know if I'm tasting something for, a product or in my kind of, with my work nose, there are definitely a lot of things that are off limits. But then I'm very lucky. I have a very high acuity for sulfur and stuff like that. So that's obviously very, very handy for the whiskey world and barrels and stuff like that. I think there's probably, and it's a bit of a weird one, I guess, especially given my background. I said before, I grew up on a farm. I grew up out in the country, and I was like hyper exposed to lots of fruit and stuff like that. But I find fruit, I'm not blind to it, but it's definitely the most challenging for me. Yeah, picking apart, like, obviously got like categories of fruit, but once you actually really get down into like the nitty gritty of kind of fruit profiles, I weirdly sometimes find that a bit challenging, which is interesting. But it's one of those things, right? You just got to kind of know where your strengths are and play to those, and then know where your team strengths are. And, hopefully you've got a good team around you who can help you out in those situations.
Exactly. And talking more into strengths and weaknesses, I think it's always interesting to dive into how people like work on their palate. What kind of tools that you use? Are they as simple as, going to the grocery store and smelling around? Like, what is your process for improvement for your own palate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I actually have and have introduced into the KPIs of my team as well, because it's something that, we're all busy. We've all got deadlines. We've all got things that are higher up on the priority list. And it's really easy to let something like that just kind of slide and you kind of just focus on what you're good at and kind of just keep on moving. So for me personally, I'm very lucky, I guess, in a sense, not from a sleeping point of view, but from a general life enjoyment point of view. I've got a 2-year-old son who is now starting to get very adventurous and want to run around and cause a bit of a ruckus. So it's been quite fun when we're out and about, either at the shops or, it's spring, almost summer here in Australia, so all the flowers are out. We go around, we smell everything. We smell like leaves and flowers, and when we're at the markets, we smell all the different fruit and, eat all those things. And when I'm cooking, we smell all the spices together and all that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of thing. I think it's, our sense of smell is like very firmly linked to our memory. We all kind of know that. And so for me, I try and at all times, whenever I can, just try and fit some of that in. And I just try and make it part of my literal everyday. Because I find sometimes it's really important to do some structured stuff. And I have done structured stuff in the past. Whenever I get time, we've got a whole heap of like threshold like chemicals and stuff up in the lab that we can kind of set up and do like, proper training with. But that's hard to do. And, we're always busy. And so I try and just every day try and, I probably look like a bit of a weirdo in the park. But now that I've got my son, it kind of gives me a bit of a free pass to be smelling things in the corner. But yeah, we just try and expose myself as much as possible to as many different flavors, and really just try and like interrogate them a little bit myself when I'm there. Try and pick them apart. That's make it into a fun little game.
Right. Well, I think it's an interesting, people who go out into the world and explore sensory, right? You're exploring things in the matrix, not to sound, new age, but you're exploring things kind of how they appear. And sometimes when you're doing sensory in a lab and you're using little chemicals and it's just one chemical that you're trying to discern, and it can be very helpful, but sometimes it's not necessarily giving you the full picture. It's not giving you how this presents in the matrix. And that's a whole other interesting thing. And you can certainly, set up lab studies or lab sensory experiences to help avoid that too.
It's hugely different. And I think we're very lucky. So just to give a little bit of context, we're actually a multi-spirits distillery. So we're kind of, I guess, breaking the mold in a sense of we produce gin and vodka and rum. We've got some brandy up in store, and we produce whiskey. We produce a wide range of whiskey. And we have a really interesting and kind of unique approach to the way that we distill things. But kind of to the point we're talking about here, whiskey is very much a matrix. The way that we produce gin, we do individual botanicals. And in that world, it is very important, and it's very precise, and you're looking for purity of flavor. And in that world, it is very important to be able to hone in on the tiny nuance between, lemongrass, lemon oil, lemon flake, that is very important. But that's a completely different world to when you're looking at a whiskey, and it's an interaction of flavors. It's not, I won't say every person in the world, but anyone who's in the kind of distilling world or bar world or whatever, in our kind of hemisphere, they can make up a cool tasting note and an interesting, it tastes like, I don't know, freshly opened pomegranate, some weird, ethereal kind of tasting note. That's great. But what's actually really important is understanding the balance. And like you said before, that matrix of flavors, when something like, I don't know, cinnamon, cassia, something like that appears, sometimes it's a really good thing. And other times it's a terrible thing. And what's actually important is being able to recognize when it's good and when it's bad. That's actually the important distinction for me that I see in sensory. It's great to be able to call cassia, absolutely. But almost if you can discern in which way it's good and which way it's bad, that's actually more powerful. The way that I see blending, that's much more powerful as a blender in the whiskey world. In that other kind of botanical side of things, if you can't tell me it's cassia, that's probably a problem. But that kind of matrix kind of balancing, it's very different skill sets.
Definitely. So let's dive a little bit more into your blending philosophy. I think we've talked a lot about balance. Is that kind of what you're striving for, or is there more to it, more to the story?
There's definitely more to the story, I guess. I think balance is a really overarching kind of thing that we focus on. It's so hard to put into words. I'm sure everyone has this problem. But the balance is a huge part, but as you kind of start to step down into that, there's so many different pieces that kind of play into that. We're also looking for, it's quite interesting. We do things a little bit differently, and we're in the new world, right? That's the beauty of being in the new world. We get to kind of define what we want to do. But we're looking for very elegant spirits as well. So, we're packing a whole heap of flavor into our spirit, as most people who are in a little bit more of a new world philosophy are trying to do. But we're kind of trying to bridge the gap between that kind of contemporary and classical kind of mindset of, the contemporary mindset is, big brash flavors, that are challenging and are challenging the status quo and challenging what people think is, a good spirit. But we all love drinking, old world spirits. We love drinking, scotch. We love drinking bourbon. I mean, and there's a certain elegance, things like cognac and these kind of real old worldy spirits. There's an elegance there. There's a kind of restrained elegance where you can kind of feel the power, but it's kind of, it's just being held back a little bit. And I think that's a huge thing that's the line we're trying to walk, I guess, from a blending perspective. And it's something that, over in the States, you guys are probably also reasonably used to. We have a very dangerous dance when we're aging a spirit here in Australia. We have big temperature swings. It's hot here. It's also cool overnight. And so, it's not like Scotland. You can't just, and I'm not poo-pooing their aging or maturation kind of style at all, because I love it and it's great. But we don't have that luxury of just saying, yeah, it looks pretty good. It's 10 years old. Let's just let it go. See what happens in 2 years, 5 years, 18 years, maybe another 20 years. We're very much closer to what's happening for you guys over in the States. Once you're kind of getting to 2 years, it's starting to shape up pretty well. 2 years, you're definitely starting to hit the kind of the bandwidth. And once you're getting to 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, you're, unless you're down in Tassie or some of the cooler areas of Australia, you're seeing a high level of attractive in there. And, it's important to realize that and recognize that. And that's the game we're playing on the blending side of things, right? When you try to produce an elegant spirit, but you kind of, everything's in fast forward, you got to be pretty on top of the game.
It brings me to an observation I've had just in our own, aging atmosphere in Oregon. It doesn't necessarily follow research that's available, right? A lot of the research that's been done on these issues is in Kentucky and Tennessee and Scotland, and those are very different models. And we kind of have an understanding of what the effects of, in Oregon we have maybe higher humidity, less temperature swings. It might model more like Scotland, but you guys have, I would imagine, really large temperature swings and not a lot of humidity.
Yeah, we're in Sydney, so we actually have a fair bit of humidity, but it's not at the kind of level that you guys see. But we're in like a nice little middle ground, and we're close to the ocean as well, so we're tempered a little bit, but yeah, we see huge swings.
When you guys are looking for a reference point for aging models, have you been able to find anything that's helpful? Is there a certain place that is better access than any other?
No, not really. That's been part of my challenge.
You guys are on the real journey of self-discovery.
Absolutely. And it's been really fun, but it's also been hugely challenging on the blending side of things. Blending's one of those kind of dark arts. If you want to be a distiller, you can, there's plenty of universities and, IBD, and there's all these resources where you can go and get an education on it. Even when you're working, you don't have to go over to university and spend time there. There's nothing like that in the kind of sensory blending world. And it's been hugely challenging for me in particular. I had zero production experience before I started this job. And I'm an engineer. The way that I have been taught, the way I think is, if you don't know something, you've got to go and learn it yourself. But then in the meantime, you've got to lean on other people's knowledge. And when you don't have access to anyone else's knowledge, you start learning. You can learn real quick. It's been very, very challenging in a really good way, but it's been great. My boss, the master distiller here, Dave Withers, is an incredible mind. Anyone who's met this guy, it's hard to describe him to people until you meet him. But has an incredibly kind of strategic and problem-solving mind, and it's been really fun. The two of us have been able to sit down and really hatch a plan of how do you compete against the world of big bourbon, the world of Scotland, the world of cognac. These have, in the last, let's say 50 years, right, there's been a growth in education and the actual kind of structures that build behind that industry. But then you go back further and you've got, 2, 3, 500 years of tradition. And some of these traditions, the companies have existed for that long. And so you have, blending houses which have notes from hundreds of years ago that they're leaning on, to create blends and to create recipes and to understand, how things work. Does that region, can you leave it longer? Can you not? What's happening when we do these kind of distillations and we age it for this, like what happened, like we don't have any of that. And so part of the fun, I guess, on our side of things has been how can we fast track that understanding ourselves? How can we set up structures within the way that we're setting up the distillation, which obviously I have nothing to do with. I openly say when I'm talking to the leadership team on the distilling side, I don't know all the lingo, I don't know all their jargon, and that's very firmly in their world. But from a conceptual point of view, I need to understand what's happening there so that we can align the sensory systems to give feedback both on what's happening in the stills, what's happening in the fermentation tanks, what's happening, the way that we're mashing everything, all the way through to when we're getting spirit out in the future. How can we then apply all that data and use that for forecasting and use that to try and skip ahead of, these centuries of experience? We need to gather, and we've been really quite fastidious on this, we need to gather data and make sure it aligns in a way that we can actually analyze it, so it can't be, tasting notes and stuff. It's going to be numbers, it's going to be real data. And, that obviously evolves, and it's evolved considerably since I started in the company in 2020. But yeah, it's been a great journey. It's been really exciting, and I've had to go back in and relearn all my statistics stuff from engineering days, which I probably forgot at the end of my degree. So yeah, it's been really, really fun, really challenging.
Can you speak a little bit more on like the data collection part of it, the fun, the sexy part of blending?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it is the most fun part. I am very numbers driven, and I love my maths and spreadsheets and stuff like that. But I also fully aware that that's not for everybody. So we have been very careful to align things. Like I was saying before, they're very different worlds, the distilling side of things and the sensory side of things. We've been very careful to make sure that we have alignment, and most importantly, at that kind of transition point where they're translating between each other. So the distilling team, and they were already like this in Rosebery, even when they were down at the craft scale, awesome data collection. So they had, these very complex spreadsheets where they're collecting all the data on all the different points. Now, back then it was very manual. And so that was also important to make sure that they could replicate things and do the same thing every time, right, to get that consistency. Now it's more so, which is the great part. Now we've scaled up. It's driven by SCADA, but there's still like a fair bit of hands-on kind of element to it. As everyone knows, SCADA systems are not perfect, and nothing ever runs perfectly all the time. And so we've adjusted the distilling catchment systems to capture data in a way that we can then reflect on and use to do analysis on. Then at the translation point, we have a daily panel every day that goes through every single thing that comes off the still. We use an 11-point scale and make sure that data is able to be analyzed from a statistical point of view. We then track all those values all the way through their maturation, all the way to the end. And at every point that we're looking at that spirit, we capture data in that same 11-point scale using the same attribute types, so that we can then trace everything back from when it comes out of the barrel all the way back to when it was first mashed in, essentially.
So I think it's really interesting, because we've talked a lot about like when you've been doing this for a while, when you have information dating back decades, maybe for your distillery, your data collection is maybe a little different because you have some analysis that have been done that can support conclusions that you're making down the line. But when you are newer and you're trying to hit that sweet spot of here's like where we're producing something, we know that it's going to follow these characteristics. You guys must have done some analysis along the way to find that 6 months. It's like, okay, here is the standard, and it's going to continue to be going down this pathway, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then we kind of reinterrogate that assumption as well. So every time we go back at it, we kind of look at it again. And, Dave and I even went, because we have an extra layer of complexity. So we have a new distillery that we're working out. I mean, it's not new now, it's 4 years old. But we moved from our oldest distillery, which they've been, producing at for 6 years. So we have product in the market that exists that we also have to, we're improving, but you also have a flavor profile that you're trying to land back into. So you have the added complexity of how do we reproduce that product that's in the market right now? Are we doing that? Are we on the right track to doing that, or improve? Let's say. So yeah, there was like an extra layer of complexity. So Dave and I, we actually did blends with new make, with 6-month-old, with 1-year-old, with 2-year-old, 3-year-old. We're now almost up to 4-year-old, and we're trying to reinterrogate those assumptions and make sure that those, and it's changed a lot, and it's been extremely helpful. Being able to feed that back into the distilling team and tweak things, because you often don't have to move the needle that much to see huge swings in outcomes, which is scary and awesome.
Yes. Is there like a particular assumption that you made that you found out over in time that you had to completely take back, or you're just like, this actually is not giving us the results we expected?
Yeah, absolutely. It was thankfully in a good way.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, good way and a bad way. There's always two sides to the coin, right? But our single malt that we produce is quite interesting in a sense. I know this isn't anything kind of super new in the world of kind of contemporary whiskey. We use specialty malts in our single malt. We take it a step further where we actually use 6 malts. So we have 5 specialty malts and pale malt in our single malt. Now, at the old distillery, we produced in, what is common, right? You have a mash bill. So it's pale malt and amber malt and dark crystal, light crystal, chocolate malt, and a little bit of peated malt. And that all goes in from the very start, from when you're milling, it goes in together. And from that point on, that is our single malt, right? Our 6 malt mash bill. When we moved to this new distillery, they actually designed the distillery to produce in what we call single streams, which is essentially like producing a different whiskey for every one of those specialty malts. And we take that from milling all the way through maturation. So what was a unique product that went into barrel and was, for want of a better word, homogenous, is now in 6 different streams. There's actually way more than 6 streams, but for keeping it simple, I'll just talk in terms of the 6 streams. So you have pale malt, which is produced, comes off the still, and goes in the barrel. We then have amber malt, which is produced, comes off the still, goes into barrel. We have light crystal, dark crystal, right? So we actually have 6 single malt whiskies that we then blend together at the end to create our 6 malt mash bill. One of the first assumptions that we made was we should produce these individual streams at the ratio that 6 malt mash bill was. Does that make sense? So let's say you have pale malt is a single stream and it's 100% pale malt. That's fine. Let's say amber might be, and we produce some crazy levels especially. So the amber malt is, let's say, about 70 to 80% amber malt and 20 to 30% pale malt. And then our light crystal would be around 60, dark crystals, I think around 50. Choc is also crazy. It's around 60% choc. We produce that liquid to then represent what would have been the same amount of liquid as a 6 malt. What we found was when you're, and this is the same thing that happened in gin production, when people started saying, hey, let's distill these botanicals individually, when you're gearing the stills to create that one flavor, you're getting that flavor in a more kind of pure and intense fashion because you're only focusing on that flavor. And likewise in single streams, when you're only trying to get, the heavy choc and espresso notes from choc malt, if you're producing a dedicated choc malt, well, you're gearing up the fermentation in a certain way. You're then distilling in a certain way. You're taking cuts in a certain way. When you produce that choc malt, you're getting way more bang for your buck, and I'm talking way more bang for your buck than when you have the equivalent amount of choc malt in a 6-malt mash bill. And we learned at 1 or 2 years that we had overproduced choc malt to quite a large amount, because it's so flavorful when you're actually just focusing on choc malt. And that the kind of percentages we're talking with here, a brewer would just think that we're crazy. You're doing a 60% choc malt. It's insane. And it is, I can tell you from a whiskey point of view, it is crazy. The flavor profile, it's so intense. But yeah, you don't need a lot of it because it packs a huge punch. So like I said, it's a good thing because we've got enough choc. We definitely aren't lacking. But yeah, we've had to make some big changes in the way that we pattern our production.
I love that. That's exactly the little aha eureka moment that, it's a good problem to have. It's a good problem to find out.
Totally.
And then you just have a whole bunch of choc malt sitting around maturing, maybe.
And it's delicious. It's delicious, but it is, when we're talking about, challenging people's palates, it's definitely to someone who drinks any kind of whiskey, they would say that is not, normal whiskey. But it's definitely fun.
When you guys are doing your 6 different malts too, are you guys doing different kind of cooperage? Or are you consistent with cooperage? Do you add another variable to the mix as well?
Yeah, so it's another interesting learning that we made. So when we first started out, again, we're trying to collect as much data as we can, right? So we used our full array of casks, including cask size, cask type, for every stream. And so you can see how quickly the complexity of this model builds. So you have pale malt in both 100, 200, American Standard, 225s, which is a kind of more common wine style size, 250s. We also have 300s, and we have some 500s kicking around. So you think in terms of let's say a sensory population. So the way that we determine a sensory population is the vatting number. So let's just say for simplicity's sake, just the single stream type and cask size. You have, what was that I said? Six different 6 different populations in every single vatting of liquid that you produce. And that very quickly, after a year, we kind of realized that we created too much complexity. And that's, again, it's a good thing. As a blender, it's great to have that. But then as, the person who's trying to do the forecasting on that, it is a terrible problem to have. And so, we've since, we still have a fair bit of complexity in our wood program, but we have definitely streamlined that. And we've realized that a smarter approach, I guess, is to now lean into what we're trying to do with each one of those flavor profiles. So the individual streams are not produced to be an individual, a product. They're produced to be a blending element. So, for instance, the pale is super fruity, super floral, with a very light cereal profile. We don't have to have a big cereal base like a normal single malt does, because we get that cereal base from our other specialty lines. And so we've decided we've shifted into aligning our wood program with each one of those single streams as well, to try and make sure that we're getting that focus and purity of the flavor design in each one of those streams. We also produce rye as well. And so you can imagine you've got different cask sizes, and we were running char types, toast types. We had ISC doing some crazy stuff for us. It was yeah, my spreadsheets are insanely large.
Yeah, a good problem, but a problem nonetheless.
Absolutely.
When you guys were looking at like different, especially different size cooperage, was this like an experiment to see what would do well in the Australian climate? Is that how that started, or is there a different origination story?
Yeah, there's a few levels to that, and again, Dave probably would be able to, the head distiller would be able to talk to you a little bit more about that. He is essentially the designer of a lot of our like flavor profiles and stuff. But there's a few elements there, right? We had to close down the old distillery while we were commissioning this new distillery. So, you have some smaller format stuff. In Australia, hundreds are reasonably normal, just in terms of, the craft. I mean, it might be the same in the States, I'm not sure. The ASP is probably a little bit more prevalent. But the 100 litre, I don't even know what that is in gallon, divided by 4. What's that, like 30 gallons maybe? It is very, very normal over here, but, your wood extraction is pretty high and it's coming online pretty early. So that's a good thing for us in terms of trying to bridge that gap between the production of the two distilleries. But then, as we discussed as well, you don't want, like, we want to try and get away from hundreds. And so that shift to 200s, 300s, and 500s is to make sure we can get that elegance that we're looking for, but still kind of lean into the Australian climate and enjoy that, right? So, hopefully the 500s give us something which is an elegant blending stock, which we could bring in to try and counteract some of the, if we do get higher extractives in, 200s. But yes, it's more, I guess, from a blending perspective, it's more about just ensuring that we do have that nice, I hate using the word blend like this, but that nice blend of different flavor profiles from a wood point of view, from that both the concentration, but then also just making sure that we're getting that elegance as well.
That makes absolute sense. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Australian whiskey climate in particular, not climate so much as weather or conditions, but more as people and innovation. Obviously, the Australian market has just been kind of booming. There's lots of people, just like in America. There's a lot of producers coming on board and a lot of really creative ideas. You guys, being one of them. What is something that you have seen come out in Australia that is really exciting?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much cool stuff over here, and we're very lucky. Like you said, the benefit of Australia, in the States, you guys are you have the ability of being both kind of new world, but then also you've got, big bourbon. It's a huge, and it's an incredible product, but it's got a huge following, right? So you kind of got to fight against that. Here in Australia, we get to, there's not as much to fight against, I guess. So you see a lot of really interesting stuff coming about. Some of the really cool stuff I've seen, people like Early Doors, someone like Starwood, who, globally are a little bit more kind of, I guess they're exposed globally to the global community. They've done amazing things with their, using wine casks and really leaning into that side of things. But then from more of a production point of view, there's some amazing work here, and it's exactly the same over in the States with native woods. We've done a few native wood smokes. We've actually changed all of our peat smoked malt to be locally smoked malt. There's some great, stuff down in Adelaide where they're using this root of this plant to smoke their malts, and you get this incredible floral profile from it. Some of the most amazing profiles that I've seen from that particular thing.
Sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but are you saying peat from Australia?
There is peat in Australia, but generally we were getting our peat from Scotland.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so there are down in Tasmania. There's some distilleries using local peat. Absolutely. there's been some wild stuff, and like, you know, people are gonna think this is pretty strange. There's one distillery that did a sheep dung smoked rye. Like,
how was it?
They're actually pretty tasty. Hard to get your head around. I said I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a sheep farm, so I've been heavily exposed to sheep dung, and not necessarily in a good way. But yeah, it's just cool. Like, I mean, again, I'm a very adventurous kind of, I guess, person from a flavor point of view. So for me, I'm just looking for what's interesting, what makes that special. I fully understand why that product is not being reproduced and is not available on any kind of scale. But pretty cool. There's also some guys over here doing some really interesting American style whiskies, which is really cool. Like, again, I hate plugging us, but, you know, we do a rye whiskey, but it's 100% malted rye. So that's like pretty interesting. It's just different to the American style. There's some great guys over in WA who do some amazing corn whiskies and like kind of the kind of classic bourbon kind of mash bill. And, you know, they produce some phenomenal whiskey over there. And really, and it says something different to the American style. You know, we don't have massive vendomes over here with thumpers. You know, you're just ripping through liquid. You're producing that big brash kind of white dog. It's a little bit more, I don't want to say elegant, but like more restrained, I guess. A more restrained product. But it's just cool to see, you know, that same mash bill with a, you know, just different kind of lean to it, which is really, really pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the scientist in me wants to compare, and those things are very hard to compare completely. Like, there's going to be differences, there's going to be similarities, but what exactly those differences are, what exactly those similarities are,
totally.
It's very intriguing.
Yeah, it's a huge thing over here. I think it's starting to become more and more, you know, focused on around the world. There's a real focus in Australia on, you know, locality and, you know, the wine term of terroir, all that kind of thing. It's been that way in Australia for a little while, but it's really great that it's starting to get some traction. You know, like, for instance, those guys over in the West, you know, they work very closely with the farmers. They've got like a farming belt down there, you know, working on some, you know, bespoke corns and bespoke wheats and, you know, very small parcel stuff. You know, we've done single paddock whiskey, you know. There's a huge focus on that here in Australia, which is great. You know, it's important. We're a huge producer of grain stock for the global market. And the problem, you know, 10, 15, 20 years was a commodity product. You know, it was a faceless product, you know, whereas now there's a lot more focus on, you know, the people who are growing this cereal and, you know, where it's come from, how it's been treated. You know, a huge growth in that here in Australia, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's an interesting to talk, you know, how far we've come from the elevator grains, right? Like, or grain elevators, how far we've come from the grain elevators and how we can really show, kind of more similar to the wine industry, the real terroir of a climate, and like it's fascinating to think about the regionality as specific as this hill that had grain. That's not the case. That's more on a wine thing. But you get what I'm saying. There's, you know, this paddock that produces this specific type of whiskey and it's acclaimed. And I mean, it's fascinating to think about if we'll get there.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the scale of whiskey, I think it will always be a small part of the discussion. And there will always be, you know, you think of the scale of the big producers, you can never do that, you know, on a paddock level. You can't do it. But I think it's really important. What I like about that discussion is it starts the discussion of, okay, let's say we can't talk about terroir and we're a bigger producer. Maybe we can talk about varieties. Maybe that's somewhere where we can play. You know, we all know that barley is not barley. There's, you know, hundreds of, you know, if not thousands of different varieties of barley that you can be using. Likewise with corn, likewise with rye. There's always a conversation we had there. And depending on your scale, there might be a slightly different conversation. But understanding that nuance and how that plays out in a whiskey is hugely important. And hugely important for the market as well. For people to understand that it's a product made with care. You've got to care about your product before they can believe that you care about it.
Absolutely. And what a great place to end.
For more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has the proven solution for distilleries. Visit them today at gdchillers.com.
Just want to say thank you for taking the time and being on Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. Really enjoyed our talk, and one day I'll get my hands on some products from you guys, or I'll have to visit. It's going to have to be one or the other or both.
Sure, we'll be able to get some in the mail for you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. If you'd like to know more about David Fisher and Archie Rose Distilling, please go to archierose.com.au. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.